What's up, y'all? It's Dr. Paul with Liberty Hill Comics, where I share my passion and over 40 years of experience comic book collecting, investing, and conservation with you. Today, we're continuing this conservation project for this copy of Flash number 139, the first appearance of the Reverse Flash, published in September 1963, written by John Broome with pencils by Carmine Infantino. This is a big Silver Age key from the Flash's Rogues Gallery, and this copy belongs to a friend of the channel. In episode 1, we did a complete walkthrough and assessment of this book and came up with a conservation game plan. In episode 2, we disassembled the book, dry cleaned it, and prepared for our wet cleaning. If you want to view either of those episodes before watching this one, just click on the link to the playlist. Today, we are going to be doing all of our wet work for this cover: aqueous cleaning, deacidification, and resizing baths, as well as tear seals with Japanese paper and wheat paste. Then we'll review our results from these processes. But before we get to our main topic, I want to remind everyone that we are closing in on our goal of 1,000 subscribers. And in appreciation of subscribers new and old, I'm giving away this copy of Star Wars #1 in CGC 7.5 with white pages. This is the first appearance of Luke, Leia, Vader, R2, 3PO, and a host of others, as well as the first cover appearance of Obi-Wan and Han Solo. It was published 6 weeks before A New Hope opened in theaters in 1977. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel and follow the link over to that video to comment there for a chance to win. As regular viewers of the channel know, I'm always studying the peer-reviewed conservation literature to find materials and methods I can apply to comic book conservation and bring to you through the channel. I just finished reading the second edition of Paper and Water by Gerhard Banach and Irene Bruekel. At 634 pages, it's a treasure trove of information for paper conservators, and I picked up several ideas from it that I wanted to apply to my aqueous baths. These are all small tweaks on my established methods, and I'm going to implement them on this comic without prior testing because they're well-established best practices in paper conservation. They are all very small tweaks to my regular practices, and in theory, all should incrementally improve our outcomes. I'll explain them in process as we perform the different aqueous washes on this cover. The first change is that in several of the chapters it is recommended that one humidifies paper before introducing it to water baths, which is something I don't normally do. So before starting the first aqueous bath, I put the cover in my humidity chamber overnight. This first bath is the same bath you've seen me use before. 500 mils total in my photo development tray between a sandwich of 2 layers of Hollytex, with 400 mils of the solution being warm tap water, and the last 100 mils being saturated calcium hydroxide, with 5 drops of Triton X100 stirred in to produce a solution that is approximately at the critical micelle concentration as described in my video on advanced washing, deacidification, and resizing for comic books. I'll leave the comic in the bath for only 5 minutes, and you've seen me before gently rock the tray a few times when I first introduce the solution and before pouring it off. But in the paper and water text, there are several mentions of the importance of convective flow to assist diffusion in completely washing the paper. And the wash is only 5 minutes long, so I decided to gently rock the tray for most of the 5 minutes, taking short breaks only to prep the next steps of my conservation effort. Note, of course, that we are putting the little torn off corner piece through all of the same washes as the remaining page. This is important. If you don't do this, when you go to mend them back together, you will have a mismatch in page color that will be very noticeable and definitely not look like a professional conservation job. If you have a bunch of pieces, you can make a little envelope for them out of Hollytex. But in this instance, I had only the one, and it was relatively easy to keep track of just loose in the Hollytext sandwich with the main page. The biggest concern here is that you might pour off the rinsate during your changeover and lose that little piece, but I was capturing the rinsate in a jar to show to you, so I wasn't concerned about that in this instance. As you can see from just how dark this rinsate is, we've removed a lot of the tanning and other contaminants, and this first rinse has obviously been very effective. I'm just going to finish up the last few moments here. I did cut a little bit of the time out just to edit it down so that you weren't watching me just rock this tray for a full 5 minutes, but I'm about ready to pour this rinsate off, and I think it's done its job. The next little tweak to my technique is in the changeover between the aqueous baths. In the past, you've seen me leave the page in the photo development tray and just pour off the solution and introduce the next solution. In paper and water, it's mentioned that laying the page, sandwiched between our Hollytext substrate of course, on paper towels between the bath changes assists in pulling the previous solution out of the paper and preparing it to receive the next. I know from professional experience just how much of a difference getting that last bit of contaminated first rinse off our subject is, so this suggestion really resonated with me, and I've decided to give it a try. Our second bath is mainly to flush out the Triton X100 and all of the contaminants that were loosened up during the first wash. It consists of 500 total mils, 400 mils of warm tap water, and 100 mils of saturated calcium hydroxide. So essentially the same as the first wash, but minus the Triton X100. Again, I elected to gently rock the tray for most of the entire 5-minute wash, only taking short breaks to prep the next steps of my conservation. You can see, although this wash is removing some of the tanning and contaminants, it's considerably less than the first wash. This rinse here, this rinsate, is quite a bit lighter in color. And so the washes are working, and that's what it's intended to do. That was 5 minutes. I added a little bit of video of just me rocking the tray out. I did use the paper towel trick in between the change out for the second and third wash. In fact, I went ahead and threw a paper towel on top of this page as well. Of course, it's not directly on the page, it's on top of the Hollytext sandwich. And I just let it there. This is a time lapse showing you what absorption occurred while I prepped the third solution. The third and final wash I performed is also intended to further rinse the contaminants and any residual surfactant from the cover. But I've also decided to resize the paper with this last wash. My rationale for this is that on occasion I've had covers that I've washed that have clearly had a degradation of the paper sizing. It doesn't always occur, but you can tell when it does. The paper is not as stiff as it ought to be, and it's much more absorbent than a comic book ought to be. It kind of feels limp. It doesn't have the mechanical strength and is more susceptible to damage than properly sized paper. I've used methylcellulose to resize Golden Age comic book covers before, so this is not new for me, but it's a bit of extra work because the methylcellulose solution is tricky to make correctly, so I don't always do it. But after reading Paper and Water, it's clear to me that for the long-term conservation of the paper, resizing is going to be best practice, so it behooves us to figure out good methods to do this, especially for Silver Age comic books. As far as the specific recipe, this last wash is also 500 mils. It's 400 mils of room temperature water with 1% methylcellulose by weight, prepared the night before as I showed you how to do in my video on advanced comic book washing, deacidification, and resizing, which you can review by following the link here. You can't just dump a pinch of methylcellulose into your bath and effectively resize the paper, because the methylcellulose is insoluble in water without being coaxed into solution. If you add methylcellulose powder directly to your aqueous solution, a protective gel forms around the powder that effectively stops the methylcellulose from going into solution. So I prepare it carefully the night before I intend to use it. To my 1% methylcellulose solution, I've added 100 ml of my saturated calcium hydroxide solution because this is the last wash and we want to make sure we leave an effective alkaline reserve in the paper to protect against future acid-catalyzed hydrolysis of the cellulose matrix. This last bath should be your protective bath for the page. The intent is for the alkaline reserve and the sizing to preserve our paper and give it the best chance of surviving the next century. I also chose to gently rock the tray essentially the entire 5-minute bath time. In contrast to our first two washes, you can see the rinsate here is almost clear, although I did notice some small particulate that developed during this wash, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. After this third wash, I'm going to go ahead and put the page under my granite slab with paper towels for about 10 minutes. I want it wet when we do our mending, but I want the bulk of the water removed from it so that it'll absorb our methylcellulose really well. And while this is pressing, let's look at the results from our 3 washes. As expected, the first bath removed a whole lot of tanning and other contaminants from the paper and is quite dark. Note the suds that ought to be present whenever you use a surfactant. The second wash is markedly lighter, but still shows considerable removal of the tanning and contaminants being rinsed away. Lack of suds shows us that we have effectively removed the Tritenex 100. We perform the calculations and use the surfactant at the critical micelle concentration to use the absolute minimum amount that will be effective at cleaning the paper and contaminants for us. So we expect it to be relatively easy to remove, but it's nice to get confirmation by the lack of suds. The last rinse is noticeably clearer, indicating that we've rinsed away the bulk of the contaminants we set out to remove. We have some suds again because the methylcellulose lowers the surface tension of the water and promotes the creation of bubbles when we poured the rinsate from the tray into the jar. One thing that concerned me is that I saw very small dark flakes in this third wash. While they're not visible in this photo, I was concerned that they were potentially flakes of ink sloughing off of the cover. Alright, we'll return to the results in a little bit, but let's complete the mending of the paper here. We have some tear seals to do and a small corner piece to reattach. You see the corner pieces there on the left, but I'm going to rotate the whole page around to make it a little bit easier to work on. Of course, I'm getting rid of the paper towels. So we have that corner piece to reattach, and then we have a compound tear on what is the bottom of the front cover. This corner piece is the upper right of the front cover, but I want to have it close to me so I can see it really well, and so I've rotated the page around. I have some Tengujo paper. This is the 5 grams per square meter, and my wheat paste that I've mixed up. Little bitty piece like this, it's sometimes easier to manipulate with a pair of forceps than with your fingers. And I have a number 5 sable brush that I'm going to use to apply the wheat paste. So this is just tedium. You need to be really patient. You need to take your time and align that corner really as close to perfectly as you can. I'm going to use a dab of wheat paste to just keep it in place while I apply the Tengujo paper. You've heard me say it many times, but you want to tear the Tengujo paper, you don't cut it. You want a nice frayed edge that'll be less obvious to a viewer, and also it'll give you more surface area for a better, stronger bond with the paper. I always lay the wheat paste down in the center and brush out toward the edges. That also helps to take those little frayed edges, fibers that you've torn, and lay them down nicely so there's a lot of interaction with the paper and it's really strong. Now I'll leave this set for a few moments without putting the Hollytext back over it. I like to, when you first lay the paste down, you'll see it looks wet and has a sheen to it. I like to wait until it's been absorbed enough that that really wet sheen goes away before I put the Hollytext back over it. So that's why you see me taking care to make sure the Hollytext doesn't flop back down on there until it's a little bit dried. Now I'm going to expose this bottom corner, and apologies, I was a little bit off camera here. I didn't realize that, but I will adjust it in just a moment. There we go. Now I've already placed the Tengujo paper down, but you'll get to see me do the paste here. This was that compound tear that we had in the very bottom that went through most of the book, right? This is that same tear that the entire front half of the book had in the interior pages as well. It's as simple as that. And then we had one other small tear adjacent to it. Again, this one was through essentially the entire book, the whole first half, but then of course when you disassemble the book, those front half pages are the same pages as the back half, right? So what it meant was, even though as you read the book, it's only sort of appears that half of the pages are ripped, in fact, that means every wrap is ripped. So I had to go through and repair all of them. That'll be in an upcoming video. This is going to be cold pressed, so I do want to make sure I don't have any wrinkles in the Hollytext and everything's laying nice and flat. Want to make sure my paper towel is centered. You've seen me many times before use this repurposed piece of granite from a leftover kitchen remodel. Here are the results after I changed out the paper towels at 30 minutes, 2 hours, and 8 hours, and then the page went into my cold press for 48 hours, after which I trimmed the excess Tengujo paper from the cover. In the before and after pictures, unfortunately, you can see we've had considerable loss of ink. My concerns that the tiny flakes I saw in the rinsate of the third wash were bits of ink media sloughing off have sadly borne out. While I'm pleased with the cleaning and the paper mending results, obviously I'm very disappointed in the loss of ink. We have to be able to do better than this in our goal of removing the contaminants and repairing the paper without loss of the printed media. So what went wrong? Well, there's a reason most folks doing wet cleaning are doing it exclusively on Golden Age comic books and not Silver Age books. The paper, the inks, and sizing are more robust on the Golden Age books and tolerate far more than the 15 minutes of total bath time I put this book through. The truth is, if introduced correctly and dried correctly, you can keep a Golden Age comic book cover in an aqueous bath for hours and hours without seeing this sort of damage. Folks with experience experimenting on Silver Age comic books have been frustrated because a technique that works great with one Silver Age comic book completely wipes another book out, and there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it, or if there is, we have yet to divine when these techniques will work and when they won't. You've seen me use these techniques many times before without this outcome, and I have treated hundreds of books similarly without this sort of ink loss and have always received universal labels from CGC for these wet cleaning techniques. I may have just gotten really unlucky with this book, but I'm not willing to accept that. Firstly, the owner of this book entrusted it to me, and I also have a commitment to you viewers to present the best information, materials, and methods for comic book conservation. My goal is to develop safe and effective methods for comic book conservation and share them with you. Toward that end, I want to start by looking at the little changes I made to my established techniques after reading Water and Paper to see if we can figure out how to avoid results like this in the future. The list of potential causes are: 1. I humidified the paper before starting the aqueous baths. While this seems innocuous, so do the other things I'm going to mention, so for completeness sake, it's on the list. I did leave the book overnight in 98% relative humidity. That may have worked water into the paper matrix and decreased the adhesion of the ink and or sizing that subsequent wash is removed. 2. Use of surfactants is generally frowned upon in conservation and only used as a last resort rather than as part of a regular recipe. I've used Triton X100 at this concentration and higher many times without an outcome like this, but perhaps it should be removed from my regular recipe and/or only used in instances for specific stubborn staining. However, that is greater than 50% of the books I work on, though, so I'd still end up using it regularly. I'd rather find a solution that works with the surfactant if possible. 3. I did gentle rocking of the tray for most of the 15 minutes total wash time across the 3 washes. Again, this should only help and it seems innocuous enough, but perhaps it's just rough enough with the fragile paper flowing within the Hollytex sandwich that it resulted in rubbing off the ink. I think it unlikely, but again, I'm putting all possibilities forth before eliminating any. Lastly, and I think most likely, this is the first time I've attempted to resize a Silver Age comic book. While I've used methyl cellulose to resize Golden Age books before, perhaps the resizing solution disrupted the adhesion of the ink to the original sized paper surface, and this, combined with rocking, was enough for the page to slough off these ink particles. This seems plausible, and given that I actually noticed the ink particulate during the 3rd wash, which was the resizing wash, and not during the first 2 washes, makes it even seem likely to me. The resizing worked well from the standpoint of paper stiffness, mechanical strength, and the paper having the correct feel, but if it's at the cost of the original ink, obviously we need to find another solution. Ultimately, I don't think I'll know without further experimentation what exactly happened here. As far as this book, I'm happy with the tear seals and the fact that we removed the tanning and acid from this page. I'm unhappy we've lost ink on the cover and will have to make good with the owner of this book on that front. We always provide a warning that there are risks to doing these procedures, especially with Silver Age books, and accidents can happen, but obviously this book was entrusted to my care, and although you could make an argument even with the ink removed the book is better off for having the tears repaired and cleaned and deacidified, that's not good enough for me. We need to be able to do better for these books, so I will continue to work on these methods until I have something that is safe and effective for as many different books as possible. For the moment, I'm going to suspend resizing on Silver Age books until I have some opportunities to do some tests on some practice books. Perhaps I need to examine a low-volume resizing method similar to the way in which I often treat interior pages on my hobby mat rather than a full submersion bath. Or perhaps I need to explore a proteinaceous sizing like gelatin rather than a polysaccharide sizing like methyl cellulose. In truth, I have been doing research trying to determine what the original sizing that was used in comic book manufacturing is and have not been able to find any definitive information yet. If anyone knows or can point me to a reference, I'd be very thankful. I sincerely appreciate you joining me today to continue this conservation project of the first appearance of the Reverse Flash. Unfortunately today, I demonstrated neither I nor the methods I'm demonstrating for you are infallible. Nevertheless, I hope you enjoyed this video and will take a few seconds to give it a thumbs up and leave a comment, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you have some relevant experience to help us develop a better wash, deacidification, and resizing protocol for Silver Age comic books, please share it in the comments below. Until next time, take care of one another.